Hi, I'm Michael Gigani, and this is Straight Talk with Regina Ip. Regina Ip, thank you very much. Now, as we all know, you have formally said that you will run for chief executive. I remember some years ago when C.Y. Leung ran for chief executive, I asked him a question. I said, would you, as chief executive, put Hong Kong's interest first or the central government's interest first? Many people say that C.Y. Leung, since becoming the chief executive, has not put Hong Kong's interest first. So I'm going to ask you this. Whose interest will you put first?
I don't think we should pitch Hong Kong's interest against national interests. Hong Kong would not benefit if national interests suffer. Even a controversial like seeking an interpretation of the basic law ultimately benefits Hong Kong. So I think basically there is no fundamental conflict. But it is the duty of every chief executive to give Beijing the best advice.
To give Beijing the best advice. But I ask the question again, sometimes there is a conflict of interest in terms of, for example, democratic reforms. The central government wants one thing, Hong Kong people want another thing. There is a conflict of interest. In that case, would you stand on Hong Kong's side or the central government's side?
Even on constitutional reform, there is no real conflict. Even though perception-wise, I know a lot of Hong Kong people, particularly young people, want greater say, But if democratic reform ends up destabilizing Hong Kong, undermining Beijing's confidence in Hong Kong, then long-term it works against our interests. So I think when the chief executive supported the August 31st decision, he had fully taken into account Hong Kong's broadest interests and long-term interests.
Even though Hong Kong people didn't see it that way?
Well, it takes time. But actually, the August 31st decision is unlikely to be a straitjacket on democratic development, because if you look at the outcome of the EC election committee recently, you see the pandem candidates, they score a record number of seats, And even with this framework, Hong Kong is becoming more and more democratic. Hong Kong people who are not necessarily supportive of government are having a bigger and bigger say. So I think the August 31st decision is really in the interest of Hong Kong's long-term development.
Okay, now, Mrs. Yip, I saw a headline that said, quoting you as saying, you will not bow to Beijing. And you've just said that the central government needs good advice.
Yes.
You said you will not bow to Beijing. The insinuation there is that the current chief executive, C.Y. Leung, has bowed to Beijing.
Well, I think we need to be careful with reading, interpreting headlines. Headlines are necessarily journalistic shorthand. My main point is that a good chief executive should be able to argue Hong Kong's case and give Beijing the best advice.
Let me rephrase that question then. Do you think C.Y. Leung did that? Give Beijing the best advice and argue Hong Kong's case?
I'm sure he tried it to the best of his ability. As to what advice he offered, naturally, I'm not in a position to know. It's a matter of personal judgment.
But in your gut feeling, knowing how Hong Kong has turned out such a divided society, do you think he gave the best advice to the central government?
Well, I've worked with Mr. Leung for 4 years on the Executive Council. I think he tried very hard. Whether he gave the best advice to Beijing, I'm really not I'm sure he tried hard to the best of his ability. Whether his advice works best, both in the interest of our country and in Hong Kong, I don't know. I'm not privy to what advice he gave.
All right, now, Mrs. Yip, let's look at a clip of yourself.
4日到嘅14。
係啊，首席代表匯報喎。
參考同自己職業有關嘅。
葉局長係冇呃你哋嘅，放長雙眼睇啦，各位。
如果我自己髮型都捍衛唔到，我點捍衛香港自己？又唔守規矩又冇禮貌，
我唔會再答佢問題。
我唔認為推動23條係污點嚟嘅。
Regina Ip then and now, starting from quite a long time ago,
Yes.
you went through a lot of turbulent
Yes,
times.
yes.
Article 23 national security legislation, you were teased, your hairstyle, your I remember, I just come back to Hong Kong when all that was happening, and I remember we communicated via email as well. And I remember at that time during the protest over Article 23 national security legislation, 500,000 people in the streets. Even your young daughter at that time came under some criticism from schoolmates. I want to ask you this, Mrs. Yip. A poll just out this week says of all the chief executive candidates, you have the lowest rating. And, you know, your daughter's a bit grown now. Why do you want to come out and compete for chief executive knowing you're going to have to go through what you went during Article 23? There's going to be a lot of mudslinging. There's going to be a lot of attacks. Why do you want to do it? You're going to put your daughter through this as well.
Well, I must say, looking back at the past footage, I'm embarrassed by the way I talked, you know, by the way I dressed, you know, at that time, over-provocative and insensitive to public perceptions, you know. But I have learned from past experience. And since I left government, I've studied hard how to change Hong Kong for the better. I've studied at university. I studied through taking part in mass elections. And I think I'll be able to bring a new vision to Hong Kong and change for the better.
But that's not the question, Mrs. Yip. I wanted to ask you, I mean, for example, look at C.Y. Leung's daughter now. She's stalked, hounded by the media, and she's ill in hospital. Your daughter went through some bad times during the protests. Why do you want to put her through this again? Are you not worried that the media will hound her and stalk her and dig up stuff about her?
Well, I'm naturally concerned. I think all candidates want to protect their families, you know, and I have a lot of sympathy for Mr. Leung, you know. But that should not be, in itself, should not be a reason to discourage candidates from standing, you know. Otherwise, no one will stand for public office. But I think rather it's a food for thought for the media, you know. How far should you go in digging into the private life or family life of each candidate? I think there should be some ground rules, you know, out of respect for democratic development.
Well, in the U.S., they don't stalk the daughters or the sons, the children of presidents.
Yeah, I know when Chelsea was at Stanford, she was well protected.
And even Obama's two daughters are well protected.
Yeah. These are rules that should be respected.
Yeah, but that doesn't happen in Hong Kong. Now, I'm going to ask you before the break this question. You have declared yourself as a candidate. Judge Wu has declared himself as a candidate. Financial Secretary John Tsang has resigned, but has not yet declared. He's waiting for the central government's acceptance of his resignation. Chief Secretary Carrie Lam has hinted that she may reconsider running or not running for chief executive. Of the names I've mentioned, Judge Wu, Judge Wu, John Tsang, Carrie Lam, who do you think is your most fierce competitor? Who do you think is the person that will give you the toughest time?
I can't really answer this question at this stage because so far only two people, the judge and I, have declared.
But Financial Secretary has resigned, and we all know he's going to declare.
This question is too hypothetical. You know, I much rather not reserve my position at this stage.
You don't see any one of them as a competitor that's too tough to beat?
I think they are all very formidable contenders, and I have respect for all of them. Judge Wu, John and Carrie, with whom I have worked, you know, they are all very formidable candidates with strong claims.
But you think you set yourself apart from them. That's
Yeah.
why you're running. You're different from them.
I'm the only one with direct electoral experience. I bring a new experience to government. I like to think so.
Okay, let's take a quick break. See you soon. Don't go away. Thanks for sticking around. This is Straight Talk with Regina Ip. Regina Ip, a declared candidate for the chief executive election. Over the past few days, you've done a number of interviews, and you have said that you think that the financial secretary, John Tsang, a potential rival of yours, has been too frugal with the money that we have saved over all these years. You have said that it should be put into helping people's livelihood. I know that the chief executive, C.Y. Leung, has tried to do the same thing, but I think that there was a conflict between him and the financial secretary as to how much should be spent. Financial secretary has always given out sweeteners, which you have criticized. Are you saying that even the chief executive could not order or control or direct the financial secretary to spend more?
Clearly, the chief executive has not been able to change the current financial secretary's public finance management philosophy.
But he's the chief executive. He can give orders, right?
Well, but as I said earlier, a good public official should be able to argue with your boss, lay out the arguments. Presumably, John laid out the arguments, about low growth, predicting a low growth rate, rapid aging of population, so that you have to avoid recurrent expenditure. As you know, he's already cutting back government expenditure. The baseline is zero, -1. If the chief executive is unable to get the better of these arguments, you cannot move the financial secretary and his team.
So are you saying that C.Y. Leung was not able to out-argue the financial secretary?
You can draw your own conclusion, but if I get elected, I will try my best to modernize, the SAR government's public finance management policy.
Okay. Now, Mrs. Yip, the one thing you said was housing is going to be a priority.
Yeah.
I know that people have asked you about Article 23, political reform, and you have said that those are the lower, quite well down your manifesto, right? On top of it is housing, livelihood issues, and so on. Now, Chief Executive C.Y. Leung, as we all know, has made housing his priority as well. He's trying to get a lot of land. And we all know that he has been tough to the so-called property tycoons, okay? He has dared to confront them where others have not dared to confront them. Will you, Mrs. Yip, if you become the chief executive, do the same? Will you tell the property tycoons that your first priority is to put a roof over people's heads at an affordable price, and you'll take on the tycoons?
Well, I think they know, that the next administration's priority must be to press ahead with public housing,
You said continue, and then you said press ahead. You're going to continue with C.Y. Leung.
Continuing to press ahead. Building public housing must be the priority of every chief executive candidate, because we have a severe shortage of public housing, whether rental housing or affordable home ownership schemes. I think the developers understand that in their hearts. As to Mr. Leung's measure, it's not just a matter of getting tough, for the sake of getting tough. It's a question of whether the measures work well. Are they workable? Are they producing the desired effects on supply and demand in Hong Kong?
Are they?
For example, the demand management measures, that is stamp duty, we can see can only suppress land prices for a while, and then they move up again. Even the 15%.
What's your solution then?
increasing land supply.
But that's what CY Leung is also trying to do.
Well, he's run into a lot of obstacles in LegCo because of lack of trust.
How do you solve that problem? Do you think you will have greater trust than him in LegCo?
For any chief executive, it will be difficult because the opposition in LegCo will continue to play its opposition role. But I think in my case, other than harking back to my Article 23 history and my old laughable sound bites, I have less holes for people to pick on in terms of alleged collusion with property sector, collusion with big business, that sort of thing. Because I came from a public service background. I have had few dealings with property developers, although I have worked in the trade and industry sectors for a long time. But if you look at my policy platform on land and housing, you will know that I understand pretty well the property market.
Okay, now you talked about the opposition will have to play its role as an opposition. And you did mention in your manifesto, Article 23, I won't go into that because you've been asked that already many times, and political reforms, but I will go into political reforms. The so-called 831, the August 31st, 2014 reform framework that the central government gave us, which was rejected in LegCo. Now, if you want to make Hong Kong a less divisive society, people say CY Leung divided Hong Kong. If you want to make it less divisive, then you've got to have to deal with political reform, right? Now, the Democrats, the opposition's bottom line is take back the August 31st reform framework, no screening of chief executive candidates, and allow self-determination. They draw a difference between self-determination and independence. Given that being their bottom line, and you know, as well as everybody else, that the central government is not going to accept those terms, how can you, as the chief executive, bridge this divide?
Well, I think I'll have to be honest with the pandems that there is very little likelihood of Beijing changing or rescinding its August 31st decision. And as we can see from the recent EC subsector elections, it's not a straitjacket on democratic development. 327 pro-pandemic candidates have been elected. Even the election committee is becoming more and more democratic. Although the pandemics were not satisfied with what they saw as not sufficient big step forward, actually these small step forward will in time translate into historic change.
They've rejected them, Mrs. Yip. The small steps forward, when we had the debate on political reform, Carrie Lam said, pocket it first. They rejected it. They don't want a small step forward. They want the step.
But you see, the recent development show that they are not really small steps. They are really quite important historic steps. Hong Kong people having a bigger and bigger say in the nomination or election of the chief executive.
You said you will be telling the opposition a home truth that central government will not rescind the August 31st reform framework. If they're not going to do that, then the opposition will not accept another package that they don't see as true democracy. How then can you unite Hong Kong? People want Hong Kong to be united, okay?
Yes.
How then do you do it?
Hong Kong, no doubt, is highly polarized.
Do you blame CY Leung for that?
No, I would not blame it on any single individual. Hong Kong is highly divided, just like many Western democratic societies. UK, pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit. UK, pro-Trump, anti-Trump. In Europe, it's the same. What we see in Hong Kong is part of a global phenomenon. Globally, there is an anti-establishment, anti-power phenomenon. So Hong Kong is really part of this picture. And people are divided, not just because of the quest for democracy, but also because of the income gap, the wealth gap, the opportunity gap, the threat of globalization, the anxiety engendered by technology change, the next chief executive has to bridge the gap by addressing all these issues.
How do you do it? That's the question. How can you address all these issues?
Starting with land and housing. You need to make land and housing, increase land supply, make housing more affordable, because as you know, in Hong Kong, practically, if you have a home, you have wealth.
Yeah, but people have been saying that it's easy to say. CY Leung said that 4 years ago, make homes affordable, increase land. 4 years later, we're still talking about it. He's not been able to succeed.
Paul Chan has made it quite clear that the government's work is below target. But he has made progress. He has done a lot more than the Donald Tsang administration. You know, housing supply has increased, even though it is not hitting the target that the administration desires. You know, I think we have to keep pushing on. And there are other things we need to do. Improve retirement protection, improve education. Education is most important, you know.
You support national education?
Everyone. Why shouldn't I? You know, every nation wants to encourage us. Want to encourage
Would you
its
do
citizens,
that as chief executive, bring it
but
back?
not as a separate subject, which adds to the curriculum burden. I think there's nothing fundamentally wrong with encouraging national education. In the U.S., they call it civics, civic
correct.
education.
I'm going to have to end it right there. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Good evening, and Merry Christmas to all of you.